Here's the notebook I've been using to plan my book. Here's all the index cards I've been using to outline my book. It's all in the trash. I just trashed my entire book, everything I've done in the last 6 months, and I'm starting over writing a book from scratch. Hello, if you're new here, my name is Stephanie, and I am trying to write a book with no experience. I definitely have taken several steps backwards today, but it's okay because I'm still going to write my book. So let's back up a little and I can explain to you how this happened. I made this decision last week and it was definitely not an easy one, but I do believe it is the right one for me. If you've seen my previous video, you will remember that I use the index card method to outline my book, where you write scenes and events on index cards and you use it to organize your whole story. I spoke then about how useful the index card method was for me, and I still stand by it 100%. And that using that index card method is what made me ultimately decide to rewrite this book. So what happened is I have written out all my scenes and I have been staring at my entire story for a few days and it just wasn't clicking for me. I was trying to solve a bunch of problems and they weren't being solved in the way that I wanted them to. And I had a few realizations at this point that I was in a little bit of trouble with my story. So the first issue I had is my entire story is based around a concept. And that was the idea for this book from the beginning. This is what inspired me to make this book. It was a concept I wrote down when I was brainstorming ideas. And I still love this concept very much. But what I realized is I had the concept and it was kind of explained in the beginning, but then the entire story revolved around things that didn't have anything to do with the concept. And then at the end of the story, I was trying to kind of find a way to fit the concept back in, and I couldn't do it because the entire story in between had nothing to do with it. And I didn't realize this until I had laid everything out, because I started to see that the things that were taking shape in my story were things that weren't related to it. It was little side quests and character arcs, and these were the things I was focused on, and I wasn't really focused on that main idea that I had for this entire book, which should have been driving the entire plot of this book. So based on that realization and seeing that the whole idea of this book was not on any index card in my index card outline, really sent me into a panic. So I sat there and just stared at these cards and was like, how do I change this story? It was going to need to be somewhat of a change, and then I needed to come up with more ideas on how to incorporate it into the story. And probably within about the next half hour, I made another realization, which was honestly worse. So for those that don't know, I've mentioned this before, I actually have 2 book ideas in my head right now. There is one book idea that I came up with a year ago, and then there's another book idea that I came up with 6 months ago. And the 6 months ago one is the one I'm working on right now. To make a very long story short, I decided to go with this story first because the first story that I came up with a long time ago, it's more involved, it's much more complex, and I didn't want to start with it because it is probably going to end up being a long series, like an epic fantasy. And I didn't want that to be my first book ever to try and write because I want to be able to do that one well. I'm still very passionate about both books, and we'll just leave it at that for now. So I've had both books in my head for some time, and I've been actively working on both of them, although I've been working on the more recent one the most, which is the one I've been showing on YouTube, because the other one I've kind of put in the back of my head. Occasionally I'll think of an idea, but it's not something I'm really working on right now. So with that being said, this was my second issue. Seeing the whole story laid out on the index cards in front of me made me realize that this story that I'm working on right now is just like the story that I'm planning for this epic series. And I did not do this on purpose, and I don't know how I didn't see it before. But what ended up happening was the characters were similar, the plot was similar, the struggles they were going through were similar, and, events that happened to them or ways to get out of certain situations were similar. If you look at the story from a very detail-oriented point of view, their situations are different. The books are different. The characters have different backgrounds. There's different magic. The things that happen are detail-wise different. But if you zoom out and see the story as a whole, these stories are very similar. And I made this realization because every time I tried to solve the first problem, which was the lack of incorporation of my idea, the ways I could get it incorporated was similar to things I had already done or thought of for the first story. And even like the smaller issues, like little subplots, I realized the way I was solving these issues or the way I was planning these events was almost identical to how the characters would do things in this other novel that I'm working on. This obviously wasn't a great place to end up. And when I had that realization, I was really shocked. And I did not know how it got this far because I have been working on this book for 6 months and I don't know how it got this far without me realizing it. But I guarantee you it was using the index card method, which laid everything out right in front of me. And that allowed me to see all these issues right away. But I realized I was kind of at a crossroads at this point where my current story really needed a restructure. Since I wasn't really sure how to change the story I'm working on right now, I thought about all my options as far as how do I proceed from here. And the first idea I had was to combine the books, maybe just write one book and, combine elements of each main character into one. I decided against this because I really love the story, the first story I came up with, this epic series. I really, really love the character, love the plot line, and I just didn't want to merge anything with that. So I wanted to keep it separate. The other idea was not to continue writing this book and go back to the first series. I decided against that because I truly do love the idea that I have come up with for this book. I think it's a really interesting concept. I just need to implement it a lot better. I think it's an interesting story and I do love my character. I didn't really want to change them. So I decided to continue with the story because I do like it. And I'm not making any kind of sacrifice because I love both stories very much. So I'm not saying like, I guess I'll keep writing it. I really want to keep writing it. So the third option I had was to just, try and fix what I had. So that would include like changing the characters a little bit, changing the plot up a little bit. But the more I stared at this outline method, I just felt like everything needed to change, and just making little tweaks here and there to make the story different wasn't really going to change the major foundational issues I had with this story. So that led me to my very last option, which was to completely trash my book and start over. And that's what I'm going to do. It's definitely overwhelming to do this. I have spent the last 6 months working on this book, and it's really frustrating that about 6 months of work is going in the trash. But I really think I have to do this. I think it's the only thing for me to do at this point to salvage this story and bring it back to life. While this is extremely disappointing, I think it's absolutely necessary. And I'll be honest, I'm kind of looking forward to going back and starting over because even though I've been working on this for 6 months, a lot of that 6 months was me just trying to figure out how I operate as a writer. So I spent a lot of time doing various exercises and trying different routines and methods. And a lot of my time, I don't want to say it was wasted, but a lot of my time was spent doing these exercises and things that weren't really helpful for me. And at this point, I do know what's helpful for me. I know that I am really creative at night. I know I'm very visual and that the index card method is definitely the way to go for me. And I know my strengths and my weaknesses in terms of creativity. So I'm going to take this knowledge of how I operate as a writer that I've learned and use it when I start brainstorming and plotting again. I don't think this will take another 6 months. I know a lot of you are anxious for me to start writing. I am too. Now I know how I operate, so I think things will go a lot more quickly. Also, I am going to have a little bit more time to work on my book in the future. So I think in terms of time, I'll have more time to dedicate it, which will help me get to the writing stage more quickly. So it's back to brainstorming for me. And what does that mean? It means I am working on the plot. I have come up with all these scenes and ideas and stuff, and I focus too much on individual scenes and fitting them into the plot as opposed to figuring out the plot and then making scenes to move the plot forward. So when I brainstorm in the future, and I'll probably talk about this in the next brainstorming video that I do, I'm going to focus mostly on the plot, that one concept that started this whole book. And I'm going to work on the plot only. I'm not going to think about other scenes. I'm not going to think about character development. I'm not going to think about magic, well, unless it has to do with the plot. And I'm just going to focus solely on making a story out of that concept. And then I'll start filling in all the details. So I know this is not the update that we were all planning on. It's definitely not the update I was planning on. But I wanted to be transparent on this journey because, especially with no writing experience, I honestly should have expected something like this to happen. I know I'm not the first person to completely trash or redo a story, but I don't see a lot of instances of it out there, so I thought it would be really interesting to share this with you. I am excited to get back to work and back into this, and hopefully I'm going to come up with a really great story for you guys.